It was one of those flights where everyone seemed in a rush. Passengers were bustling to stow their luggage, checking their tickets, and settling into their seats. Among them was Dr. Maya Bennett, a renowned surgeon who had spent years breaking barriers in a field often dominated by stereotypes and biases. She was calm, composed, and quietly enjoying a rare moment of relaxation before a long overdue vacation. Dressed in a simple yet elegant blazer and jeans, Maya didn't stand out in the crowd until she took her seat in first class. As she placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, she could feel a few glances darting her way. It wasn't uncommon for Maya to be met with curiosity or even skepticism in spaces where she was often the only black woman. She had grown used to it, though it never became less frustrating. But today, she told herself, she wouldn't let anyone disturb her peace. A few minutes later, as the plane filled up, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit entered the first-class cabin. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and carried himself with an air of entitlement. His demeanor made it clear he believed this section of the plane belonged to people like him, people who fit a certain image of success. When his eyes fell on Maya, his expression shifted from neutral to a subtle frown. He stopped in the aisle, as though he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Maya caught his lingering stare and gave him a polite nod before returning to her book. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, she was here to enjoy her flight. But the man didn't move. Instead, he leaned toward a flight attendant nearby, gesturing toward Maya. His voice wasn't loud enough for everyone to hear, but it was clear he had an issue. "Excuse me," he said, his tone laced with indignation. "Are you sure she's supposed to be here?" The flight attendant looked puzzled. "Pardon me, sir." "That seat," he said, pointing toward Maya, who was now looking up, confused. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. First class is for, well, you know." His voice trailed off, but the implication was loud and clear. Maya set her book down and took a deep breath. She had encountered men like him before, men who couldn't fathom that someone like her could belong in spaces they deemed exclusive. But what annoyed her most wasn't just his assumption, it was the way he tried to mask his prejudice with false politeness. The flight attendant glanced nervously between the man and Maya. "Sir," she began, "this is Dr. Bennett's seat. Everything is in order." The man's eyebrows shot up. "Doctor," he repeated, almost as if the word tasted foreign in his mouth. "Doctor of what?" Before the flight attendant could respond, Maya spoke up, her voice calm yet firm. "I'm a surgeon," she said, meeting his gaze. "Is there a problem?" Her response seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly unsure how to proceed. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "It's just unusual," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I mean, you don't exactly look like a surgeon." Maya's expression didn't waver, but inside, a familiar mix of frustration and exhaustion stirred. She knew exactly what he meant, even if he didn't say it outright. Still, she wasn't about to let him dictate the narrative. "Really?" she replied, her voice still composed. "And what does a surgeon look like to you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. The man seemed flustered, but his sense of entitlement wouldn't let him back down. "I just mean that this seat is usually reserved for people who work hard, achieve their goals, and pay for their tickets." Maya interrupted, her words sharp but not angry. "Because if that's what you mean, then yes, I belong here." By now, several people in the cabin were watching the exchange. The man's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to concede. "Look," he said, his voice rising slightly, "I just think it's fair to ask if you're really supposed to be in first class." Before Maya could respond, the flight attendant stepped in. "Sir," she said firmly, "Dr. Bennett's ticket is valid, and she is in her assigned seat. I suggest you take yours before we delay the flight any further." The man huffed but reluctantly moved to his seat, a few rows ahead. Maya could feel the tension in the cabin easing as people returned to their own business. She picked up her book again, determined not to let the encounter ruin her mood. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because as the flight continued, the man's sense of entitlement would lead him to make yet another attempt to undermine her. And this time, Maya's response would leave him, and everyone else, speechless. As the plane ascended into the skies, Dr. Maya Bennett tried to focus on her book, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter with the man in the suit. She wasn't a stranger to these kinds of interactions. Whether it was in the hospital, at conferences, or even in everyday life, there always seemed to be someone who questioned her achievements or presence. It didn't matter how many lives she saved or how many awards lined her office walls. Some people simply couldn't see past their own biases. Maya glanced out the window, watching the clouds blur by. She thought about her journey, the countless hours of study, the sleepless nights during residency, and the sacrifices she had made to reach this point. She wasn't just a surgeon. She was one of the best in her field, known for her precision and composure under pressure. But moments like these reminded her that no amount of success could shield her from prejudice. A soft chime announced the beginning of the in-flight service. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. When they reached Maya, she smiled warmly and asked for a cup of tea. The attendant returned the smile, her demeanor more relaxed now that the earlier tension had subsided. Just as Maya began to settle back into her seat, she noticed the man in the suit looking over his shoulder. His eyes flicked toward her, his expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. He seemed to be debating whether to say something. Maya sighed internally. She could already tell he wasn't done. Moments later, the man pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, he leaned in close, speaking in a low voice. Maya couldn't hear the exact words, but she could see the discomfort on the attendant's face. The woman nodded reluctantly and walked toward the cockpit, leaving the man looking smug. Maya decided to let it go. She wasn't in the mood for another confrontation. Instead, she sipped her tea and reminded herself that she had faced far worse than a stranger's misplaced arrogance. But then, to her surprise, the flight attendant returned with a second crew member, this one appearing to be a senior staff member. Together, they approached Maya's seat. "Dr. Bennett," the senior attendant began, her voice calm but cautious. "I hope you're comfortable. I wanted to check if everything is all right." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied, but her tone carried a hint of confusion. "Why do you ask?" The attendant hesitated, glancing briefly toward the man in the suit, who was now pretending not to pay attention. "We've had a passenger raise some concerns about seating arrangements. Of course, we've assured him there's no issue, but I wanted to personally confirm that you're settled." Maya felt a flicker of anger. She didn't need to ask who had raised the so-called concerns. Still, she kept her voice steady. "I appreciate you checking, but I'm perfectly fine. As you can see, I'm in my assigned seat." The attendant nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. Please don't hesitate to let us know if you need anything." She turned to leave, but not before shooting a pointed glance toward the man. As the attendants moved away, Maya caught the man's eye. He quickly looked away, feigning interest in the in-flight magazine. It was clear he had hoped for a different outcome. Maya shook her head, a mix of disbelief and amusement tugging at her lips. Did he really think his antics would result in her removal? If anything, his behavior only made him look ridiculous. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting Maya from her thoughts. She tightened her grip on the armrest, her mind drifting to memories of her first flight. She had been just a kid, traveling with her mother to visit family in another state. Back then, they'd flown economy, saving every penny to make the trip possible. Her mother had been so proud, constantly telling Maya she could achieve anything she wanted if she worked hard enough. Those words had stuck with her, even during the toughest times. Like when she was the only black student in her medical school class, facing subtle and not so subtle remarks from peers and professors, or when she'd been overlooked for opportunities despite outperforming her colleagues. But Maya had refused to let those challenges break her. Instead, she used them as fuel to prove her doubters wrong. The turbulence passed, and Maya released her grip on the armrest. She glanced at the man again, wondering what drove people like him. Was it ignorance, insecurity, or simply the inability to see beyond their own worldview? Whatever the reason, she wasn't about to let it ruin her day. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the meal's service. Maya declined the offer of dinner, deciding instead to catch up on some rest. She adjusted her seat and closed her eyes, hoping to escape into a peaceful nap. But just as she was drifting off, she heard a familiar voice. "I'm just saying, it's not what you'd expect," the man was saying, louder than necessary. He was speaking to the passenger beside him, a younger man who looked increasingly uncomfortable. First class used to mean something. Now anyone can buy their way in. Maya's eyes snapped open. She turned her head slightly, catching the younger man's awkward smile as he nodded politely, clearly trying to end the conversation. The older man, however, seemed oblivious, continuing his tirade. "You work hard, earn your place, and then, well, you see what happens," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's just not the same anymore." Maya felt her chest tighten. She wanted to speak up, to call him out for his blatant disrespect. But she also knew that engaging with someone like him might only escalate the situation. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that her silence could be just as powerful as her words. Still, the man's comments lingered in her mind. They weren't just about her. They were about the countless people who faced similar judgments every day. People who had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. People who deserved better than to be dismissed by someone who didn't even know their story. As the flight continued, Maya decided she wouldn't let his behavior slide entirely. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew she'd find a way to address it, on her terms. For now, though, she leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes again, letting the hum of the plane lull her into a light sleep. Whatever came next, she was ready. Maya woke up to the soft hum of conversation around her. The cabin lights had dimmed further, signaling the beginning of the quiet hours on the flight. Most passengers were either asleep or engrossed in their screens, but she noticed the man in the suit wasn't among them. He was sitting upright, his face illuminated by the glow of his tablet. From where she was seated, she could see him scrolling through an article, his expression intense. It wasn't unusual for Maya to observe people. It was a habit honed from years of studying human behavior, whether in patient consultations or high-pressure surgeries. But something about this man intrigued her. What made someone like him feel entitled to judge others so openly? Was it arrogance, ignorance, or something deeper? She wasn't sure, but she had a nagging sense that his behavior was rooted in more than just a bad attitude. As she watched him, a thought crossed her mind. What if he had a reason for his bitterness? It wasn't an excuse, but Maya had learned over time that people's actions often stemmed from experiences they couldn't, or wouldn't, share. Still, she reminded herself that his behavior, whatever the cause, wasn't her responsibility to fix. The flight attendant returned, moving quietly through the aisle with a tray of water bottles. When she reached Maya's row, she leaned in and spoke softly. "Dr. Bennett, I just wanted to apologize again for earlier. Some passengers can be difficult." Maya smiled, appreciating the gesture. "It's not your fault," she said. "Thank you for handling it professionally." The attendant nodded, hesitating for a moment before adding, "If it helps, I've dealt with passengers like him before. They always seem to have something to prove." Maya nodded knowingly, her mind returning to the man in the suit. She wanted to brush off the encounter as just another example of ignorance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The way he had reacted to her presence, the persistent comments, the need to involve the flight crew, it all felt calculated, as though he couldn't stand the idea of being challenged. The attendant moved on, and Maya returned to her thoughts. She decided that she wouldn't confront him directly, at least not yet. Instead, she'd observe and wait, letting him reveal more about himself. People like him often did, given enough time. Across the aisle, the younger man who had been sitting next to the suited passenger glanced in Maya's direction. His expression was apologetic, as if he wanted to distance himself from the older man's behavior. Maya offered him a small, reassuring smile, letting him know she didn't hold him responsible. A while later, as the cabin grew quieter, the man in the suit stirred. He shifted in his seat, then stood, stretching before walking toward the lavatory. Maya watched as he passed her, his movements deliberate, as though he was asserting his presence. She didn't react, instead keeping her focus on her book, though her mind remained alert. When he returned, he paused briefly near her row. "I hope you're enjoying your seat," he said, his voice low, but laced with sarcasm. Maya looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am, thank you," she replied evenly, her tone calm but firm. "I hope you're enjoying yours as well." The man seemed momentarily taken aback by her response. He opened his mouth to say something but thought better of it, continuing to his seat without another word. Maya let out a quiet breath, her composure intact but her patience wearing thin. As the flight progressed, Maya's thoughts drifted to her family. She thought of her father, who had faced his own share of challenges as one of the first black engineers at his company. He had always told her to stand tall, no matter what. "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone," he'd said. "Your work speaks for itself." Maya also thought of her mother, who had been her biggest cheerleader. It was her mother's unwavering belief in Maya's potential that had pushed her through the toughest moments. Her parents had taught her resilience, and today was just another test of that strength. The man in the suit, meanwhile, remained a source of tension in the cabin. He seemed restless, shifting in his seat and occasionally glancing in Maya's direction. It was as though her presence unsettled him, though she couldn't understand why. What was it about her that posed such a threat to him? At one point, the younger man seated next to him got up and approached Maya. He leaned down slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said. "I don't know what his problem is, but not everyone thinks like that." Maya appreciated the gesture, though she sensed the younger man felt trapped in an awkward situation. "Thank you," she said, keeping her voice low. "It's not the first time, and unfortunately, it probably won't be the last." He nodded, looking genuinely apologetic. "If it helps, I think he's just bitter about something. He's been complaining since we boarded." Maya smiled faintly. "Sounds like he has a lot on his mind." The younger man hesitated, as though debating whether to say more, but then returned to his seat. Maya watched him go, her thoughts swirling. She wondered if the man in the suit had always been this way, or if life had shaped him into someone so bitter. Either way, it didn't excuse his behavior, but it did make her curious. The plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with instructions for landing. Maya buckled her seatbelt, her mind still turning over the events of the flight. She didn't know what awaited her on the ground, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over yet. As the plane continued its descent, the tension in the first-class cabin seemed almost tangible. Maya could feel it in the way passengers avoided looking directly at the man in the suit, their discomfort palpable after witnessing his earlier behavior. He sat rigidly in his seat, his expression unreadable, but his energy still radiated discontent. Maya tried to ignore it, focusing on her breathing to stay calm, but she could sense something lingering, an unspoken challenge, waiting to unfold. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin one last time to ensure everyone was secure for landing. Maya took the opportunity to glance toward the man once more. He caught her gaze for a fleeting moment, and his lips curled into a faint, condescending smirk. It wasn't the kind of smile meant to disarm or connect, it was meant to provoke. Maya held his gaze just long enough to show she wasn't intimidated before looking away, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to crave. The plane touched down smoothly, and the cabin filled with the familiar rustling of passengers gathering their belongings. Maya remained seated, letting the crowd ahead of her move first. She always preferred to avoid the chaos of disembarking, But this time, she also wanted to see if the man would make any further moves. Something about his demeanor suggested he wasn't quite finished. As the line of passengers inched forward, the man stood abruptly and retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment. Instead of joining the line, he lingered in the aisle near Maya's row. His posture was stiff, his expression carefully controlled, but there was an edge to his movements that suggested he was gearing up for something. Maya kept her composure, though her instincts were on high alert. She'd have faced plenty of difficult situations in her career. Patients crashing during surgery, life-or-death decisions made in seconds. But this was a different kind of challenge. This wasn't about skill or training. This was about standing her ground in the face of someone who seemed determined to undermine her. When the aisle finally cleared enough for Maya to stand, she rose gracefully and pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin. The man took a deliberate step back, making a show of giving her space, but his presence loomed uncomfortably close. Maya felt the weight of his eyes on her as she turned to step into the aisle, and for a moment, she thought he might actually say something. But instead of speaking, he let out a small, derisive chuckle. It was low, almost inaudible, but it carried enough weight to be a deliberate act of provocation. Maya paused, her grip tightening on her bag. She turned her head slightly, her voice calm but firm when she spoke. "Is there something you'd like to say?" she asked, her tone steady and unyielding. The man hesitated, as though weighing his options. Then, with a dismissive shrug, he said, "I just find it interesting, that's all. You're very confident." Maya raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "Confidence comes from knowing your worth," she replied. "You should try it sometime." Her words landed like a sharp jab, and the man's smirk faltered for just a moment. The passengers nearby, who had been trying to pretend they weren't listening, now openly watched the exchange. The tension crackled in the air, thick enough to cut through. The man recovered quickly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Well, I suppose confidence is easy when you don't have to earn it the hard way." Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't let him see her frustration. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She took a slow, deliberate breath, reminding herself of her father's words, "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone." "Let me assure you," Maya said, her voice measured, "everything I've achieved, I've earned. And I've earned it by working harder than you could probably imagine." The man's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a flash of something that looked almost like uncertainty. Maya didn't give him a chance to respond. She turned and stepped into the aisle, walking away with her head held high. Behind her, she could hear murmurs from the other passengers, some of them offering quiet words of support. As she exited the plane and stepped into the bustling terminal, Maya felt a mix of emotions, frustration, pride, and an odd sense of relief. She had stood her ground, refusing to let the man's arrogance define the moment. But she also knew this wasn't the end. The encounter had left its mark, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was leading to something bigger. Walking toward baggage claim, Maya replayed the interaction in her mind. She wasn't just upset about what had happened, she was upset about what it represented. The man's behavior was a reminder of the barriers she and so many others faced daily. But it was also a reminder of her own strength, her ability to rise above the noise and keep moving forward. She spotted the man again near the baggage carousel, his posture as stiff as ever. He was scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to the world around him. Maya debated whether to approach him, to say something that might leave a lasting impression, but she hesitated. She didn't want to give him more attention than he deserved. Instead, she focused on the people around her, the family laughing as they reunited, the travelers rushing to make their connections, the airport staff working tirelessly to keep everything moving. It reminded her that for every person like the man in the suit, there were countless others who saw her for who she truly was. Still, she couldn't deny the lingering tension. The man's parting words, his calculated demeanor, it all felt unfinished, like a storm waiting to break. And as Maya retrieved her bag and headed for the exit, she couldn't help but wonder. Was this encounter truly over, or was it just the beginning? Maya wheeled her suitcase toward the curb where rideshares and taxis lined up, her mind still replaying the strange interaction with the man in the suit. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that it wasn't entirely over, though she hoped she was wrong. The chill of the evening air wrapped around her, and the hustle of the airport gave her a momentary sense of anonymity. For a fleeting second, she thought she could leave the tension of the flight behind. Just as she was pulling up the rideshare app on her phone, a voice called out from behind her, "Dr. Bennett." She turned slowly, already knowing who it was. The man in the suit stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but his stance tense, as if he'd been deliberating whether to approach her. Maya's stomach tightened, but she kept her composure. "I didn't realize we were on a first-name basis," she said coolly, her voice steady despite the tension simmering between them. He didn't react to her jab, instead stepping closer. "Look, I want to clarify something," he said, though his tone suggested anything but an apology. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Clarify," she repeated, her skepticism evident. The man glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening, then fixed his gaze back on her. "I think you misunderstood my intentions earlier," he began, his words measured. "It wasn't personal." Maya's patience, already worn thin, threatened to snap. "Oh, it wasn't personal," she said, her voice laced with incredulity. "You singled me out, questioned my qualifications, and made assumptions about me based on nothing more than your own biases. How is that not personal?" The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Maya thought he might walk away. But instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand," he said. "I know who you are." The words hit Maya like a jolt. Her eyes narrowed as she studied his face, searching for any hint of recognition. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone cautious but firm. "I've seen your name before," he admitted, his voice dropping even further. "You were involved in a malpractice case a few years ago, a high-profile one." Maya felt her breath catch, though she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't a secret. The case had been splashed across headlines, though it had ultimately been resolved in her favor. A disgruntled patient's family had tried to blame her for a poor outcome, despite overwhelming evidence that she had done everything possible. It had been a painful chapter in her career, one that had tested her resilience and her faith in the justice system. "And?" Maya prompted, refusing to let him see any hint of vulnerability. The man hesitated, as if weighing his next words. "I followed that case closely," he said, "not because I cared about the outcome, but because it involved someone I knew. A colleague of mine was brought in as an expert witness against you." Maya's mind raced, piecing together the threads of his revelation. She remembered the expert witness, a respected surgeon who had testified about the standard of care. His testimony had been clinical, impartial, and ultimately unconvincing to the jury, but it had stung nonetheless to have a fellow professional scrutinize her work so publicly. "What does that have to do with this?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The man's expression hardened. "That colleague is a close friend of mine," he said. "He believed you were reckless, that you made a mistake that cost someone their life. And when I saw you sitting in first class, acting like you belonged there, it got under my skin." Maya stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and something she couldn't quite name. She took a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm. "You judged me based on someone else's opinion," she asked. "Without knowing the facts, without understanding the situation. You decided I didn't deserve to be here because of your own misplaced loyalty." The man looked away, as though her words had struck a nerve. He began, but Maya cut him off. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice firm. "I didn't just act like I belonged in first class. I do belong there. I've earned every seat at every table I've ever been at, including this one. And whatever grudge you or your friend are holding onto, it has nothing to do with me, so stop projecting your insecurities onto me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the airport seemed to fade into the background as they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Maya could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but whether it was doubt about her or himself, she couldn't tell. Before he could respond, the sound of her rideshare driver honking broke the tension. Maya turned toward the car, her suitcase in tow, but she paused just long enough to deliver one final remark. "If you're looking for someone to blame, maybe you should start by looking in the mirror," she said. Then, without waiting for a response, she walked away, leaving him standing there in the cold. As she slid into the back seat of the car, Maya felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The confrontation had been unexpected, but it had also been a reminder of the strength she had built over years of navigating a world that often doubted her worth. She wasn't sure if she'd ever see the man again, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't forget this encounter anytime soon, and neither would she. The car pulled away from the curb, and Maya sank into the seat, trying to process everything that had just happened. The man's words lingered in her mind, not because they held any truth, but because of what they represented, a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there would always be people questioning her right to succeed. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the hum of the car engine soothe her nerves. As the city lights blurred past the window, Maya's phone buzzed in her bag. She hesitated before reaching for it, unsure if she wanted to deal with anything else tonight. When she finally pulled it out, she saw a notification for a new email. She opened it out of habit, and her stomach flipped as she read the sender's name, the hospital board. The subject line was vague, but it carried an ominous weight: URGNT, follow-up required. Maya opened the email, her heart pounding. It was a brief message requesting her presence at an emergency meeting the following morning. No details were provided, but the tone was unmistakable. Something serious was unfolding. Maya's mind raced. Was it related to the man in the suit? Had he taken his grudge further than a tense exchange at the airport? When the car reached her apartment, Maya stepped out, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind spinning with questions. She barely slept that night, replaying the events of the day and wondering what could possibly be waiting for her at the meeting. By the time her alarm went off, she felt like she hadn't rested at all. The hospital boardroom was unusually full when Maya arrived the next morning. Faces she recognized, colleagues, administrators, and even legal counsel, were seated around the long table. At the head of the room was the hospital director, her expression unreadable. Maya felt a wave of unease as she took her seat. "Dr. Bennett," the director began, her tone formal but not unkind. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We've received information that requires immediate attention." Maya kept her composure, though her pulse quickened. "Of course," she replied. "What's going on?" The director exchanged a glance with one of the legal advisors before continuing. "Yesterday, we were contacted by an individual claiming to have new evidence related to the malpractice case you were involved in 3 years ago. They allege that this evidence implicates you in negligence." Maya's breath caught. She immediately thought of the man from the flight. Was this his doing? Had he fabricated something to settle a personal score? But as the director continued, Maya realized the situation was even more complicated than she had imagined. "The individual in question identified themselves as a former colleague of yours," the director said. "They claim to have been pressured into withholding critical information during the original trial." Maya's mind reeled. She thought back to the expert witness who had testified against her. Could it be him? Had he changed his story after all this time? And if so, why now? Before she could respond, the door to the boardroom opened, and a man walked in. Maya's eyes widened in shock as she recognized him. It wasn't the man from the flight, but the expert witness himself. He looked older than she remembered, his face lined with what could only be described as regret. He carried a file in his hands, which he placed on the table before addressing the room. "I need to set the record straight," he began, his voice trembling slightly. 3 years ago, I gave testimony that I now believe was incomplete. I didn't intentionally mislead the court, but I withheld information under pressure from external parties. I've carried the weight of that decision ever since." Maya's heart pounded as he opened the file and began explaining the new evidence he had brought. It was a detailed account of the circumstances surrounding the case, including correspondence that revealed how certain parties had manipulated the narrative to shift blame onto her. The room was silent as he spoke, the gravity of his confession sinking in. When he finished, the hospital director turned to Maya. "Dr. Bennett, based on this new information, we believe you were wrongfully targeted in the original case. We'll be working to clear your name publicly and ensure that justice is served." Relief washed over Maya, but it was tempered by the emotional toll of revisiting such a painful chapter in her life. She met the expert witness's eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a man burdened by guilt and determined to make amends. As the meeting concluded, Maya stayed behind to speak with him privately. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. He hesitated before answering. "Because someone reminded me what integrity looks like," he said, "and because it's never too late to do the right thing." Maya felt a flicker of understanding. She didn't need to ask who that someone was. The man from the flight, for all his hostility, had unknowingly set this chain of events in motion. His misguided attempt to challenge her had ultimately led to a resolution she hadn't thought possible. As she left the boardroom, Maya felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The past couldn't be changed, but the truth had finally come to light. And in a twist she never could have predicted, the conflict with the man in the suit had turned out to be a catalyst for something far greater. Walking out of the hospital, Maya stood a little taller, knowing she had faced every challenge head-on and emerged stronger for it. The journey wasn't over, but this chapter was finally closed, and she was ready for whatever came next. Maya stepped out of the hospital into the crisp morning air, her mind buzzing with the events of the past 24 hours. The weight she had carried for years had finally begun to lift, and though she still felt the sting of the ordeal, there was something liberating about the truth coming to light. She paused on the steps outside the building, letting the sun warm her face as she took a deep breath. It was over, or at least the hardest part was. The ride home was quiet, allowing her thoughts to settle. She replayed the meeting, the unexpected turn of events, and the strange connection between the man on the flight and the resolution of the case. It was almost poetic, she thought, how one encounter had sparked a chain reaction leading to justice. Life had a funny way of weaving seemingly unrelated threads into something meaningful. When she arrived at her apartment, Maya finally allowed herself to relax. She kicked off her shoes, brewed a cup of tea, and sank into the comfort of her couch. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had heard about the meeting, offering their support and congratulations. She smiled at their kind words, but one message stood out. It was from the hospital director, thanking her for her resilience and professionalism throughout the ordeal. For a long time, Maya simply sat there, letting the reality sink in. The storm had passed, but it left her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She thought about the people who had doubted her, the battles she had fought to prove her worth, and the lessons she had learned along the way. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a reminder of the importance of perseverance, integrity, and standing up for oneself. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered outside her window, Maya decided to write a letter to the expert witness. She didn't know if she would ever send it, but she felt compelled to put her thoughts into words. She thanked him for his courage in coming forward and acknowledged how difficult it must have been for him to admit his mistakes. She didn't absolve him completely, after all. His testimony had contributed to years of stress and scrutiny, but she recognized his efforts to make things right. As she finished writing, Maya realized she wasn't just addressing him. She was also letting go of the anger and frustration that had weighed her down for so long. It was a small but significant step toward healing. The next day, Maya returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. Her colleagues greeted her warmly, many of them offering words of encouragement and support. It felt different now, lighter, freer. She walked into the operating room with the same confidence she always had, but this time, there was an added layer of resolve. She knew she belonged here, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. A few weeks later, Maya was seated in a cafe near the hospital, catching up on some reading, when a familiar figure appeared at the entrance. It was the man from the flight. He hesitated when he saw her, as if unsure whether to approach. Maya considered ignoring him but decided against it. Instead, she gave a small nod, inviting him over. He walked up to her table, his expression a mix of discomfort and curiosity. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone more subdued than the last time they'd spoken, "I didn't expect to see you here." Maya gestured to the empty seat across from her. "It's a small world," she said, her voice neutral. He sat down, fumbling with the strap of his bag. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I heard about what happened with the case," he said. "The new evidence. I didn't know." Maya studied him carefully, noting the slight unease in his posture. "You didn't know," she repeated, her tone neither accusatory nor forgiving. "And yet, you were so certain of my guilt." He winced, his gaze dropping to the table. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I made assumptions about you, and I was wrong." Maya didn't let him off the hook immediately, but she appreciated the effort it took for him to admit that. "It's easy to make assumptions," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But it's harder to confront them and change." Maya didn't let him off the hook immediately, but she appreciated the effort it took for him to admit that. "It's easy to make assumptions," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But it's harder to confront them and change." He nodded, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything." Maya considered his words, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said. "I hope this experience has taught you something, not just about me, but about the way you see the world." He nodded again, a look of genuine remorse on his face. They parted ways shortly after, and though Maya didn't feel the need to dwell on the encounter, she was glad it had happened. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. As the weeks turned into months, Maya continued to focus on her work, her patients, and her own well-being. The hospital issued a public statement clearing her name, and the support she received from the community was overwhelming. It was a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place: to help people, to make a difference, and to overcome challenges with grace and determination. The experience left her with a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. She realized that resilience wasn't just about surviving difficult moments, it was about finding strength in them and using that strength to move forward. And while the road hadn't been easy, it had led her to a place of clarity and purpose. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the city lights twinkle, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the triumphs, and the unexpected twists. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was hers, and she wouldn't change a thing. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and smiled, ready for whatever came next.